What really happened behind palace walls at the end? In January 2026, a single sentence suddenly shook the British media and reopened an old royal wound. The statement, which circulated through newsrooms and diplomatic channels in the early morning of January 29th, appeared matter-of-factly worded, yet unleashed an explosive force that went far beyond ordinary palace communications. The text made it unequivocally clear that no private foundation, after the withdrawal from royal service, was entitled to benefit, explicitly or indirectly, from the authority, symbolism, or privileges of the crown. Where confusion had arisen, it had to be cleared up. Where advantages had been gained, explanations were demanded. Within minutes, Buckingham Palace confirmed the authenticity of the statement. Shortly afterward came the second blow, this time not in the form of words, but documents. Internal investigators, working as part of a joint review authorized by Princess Anne and Prince William, had compiled a comprehensive dossier. The focus was on the Archewell Foundation, its finances, its public image, and above all, the question of whether the line between private engagement and royal representation had been crossed. The timing was no coincidence. 4 weeks behind-the-scenes rumblings had been sparked by international appearances that, in tone, staging, and handling, strikingly resembled official royal tours. One trip in particular, the visit to Nigeria, moved into the spotlight. While public images showcased humanitarian commitment and symbolic gestures, internal documents revealed a number of uncomfortable contradictions. At that time, the Archewell Foundation had been classified as non-compliant by the relevant authorities and was officially prohibited from soliciting donations or awarding grants. Nevertheless, it had managed to organize a trip with a diplomatic air. This is precisely where Princess Anne intervened. Within the royal household, she has been regarded for decades as an uncompromising guardian of protocol and institutional clarity. For her, it wasn't about personal motives or public sympathies, but about a principle: the crown must never become a backdrop for private ventures. In internal discussions, it became clear that Anne was less outraged than alarmed. The ongoing public uncertainty about whether certain activities were still being carried out in the name of the United Kingdom was seen as a serious threat to the monarchy's credibility. Prince William, however, supported this course of action, albeit with a different emphasis. While Niney pulled the strings, William prepared the structural response. His role as Prince of Wales placed him in a position where he represented not just individual patronages, but the overall picture of modern royal responsibility. Internal comparisons between the tightly regulated working methods of his own projects and the publicly available information about the Archewell Foundation amplified the unease. The discrepancy between the claim to visibility and the documented work output was considered problematic internally. The statement of January 29th was therefore less a spontaneous outburst than the visible culmination of a quiet escalation. It signaled that the royal household was no longer willing to tolerate grey areas. For the first time since the Duke and Duchesses of Sussex retired from active service, a line was not only drawn internally but also publicly declared. Observers spoke of a turning point because the tone remained deliberately matter-of-fact, yet the message was unambiguous. In the British public sphere, the intervention was quickly interpreted as a decisive statement. While tabloid media emphasized the drama, more serious debates shifted to a fundamental level. How far can private charity go when it is undertaken by former representatives of the crown? Where does personal commitment end and institutional responsibility begin? And why was this dividing line drawn so clearly only now? At the end of this first chapter, there is less an answer than an open front. Princess Anne's statement was not a judgment, but a declaration. It made clear that there would now be review, comparison, and, if necessary, correction. The crown had marked its position, coldly formal and without regard for public sensitivities. But was this the beginning of a reckoning, or merely the prelude to an even larger debate about power and the future of royal authority? While public attention was still focused on the sharply worded statement from the palace, behind the scenes a far more mundane matter was being addressed: room figures, deadlines, and file notes. It was precisely here that the true gravity of the affair developed. The Archewell Foundation, presented to the outside world as a modern philanthropic vehicle, increasingly came under scrutiny because its financial performance did not keep pace with its public image. What began as a formal review quickly transformed into a detailed inventory with unpleasant results. Publicly available documents revealed that the foundation had experienced a massive decline in donations. Within a year, income shrank drastically, while expenditures simultaneously rose sharply. This discrepancy raised eyebrows even among seasoned observers. Particularly striking was the fact that only a comparatively small portion of the funds flowed directly into designated charitable programs. The vast majority of the budget was allocated to operating costs, including administration, fees, and other expenses that bore no clear relation to the declining revenue. This trend did not go unnoticed at the palace. Internal analysts compared the figures and concluded that the foundation was increasingly distancing itself from traditional charitable structures. While other royal initiatives emphasized transparency, long-term planning, and clearly defined programs, the Archewell Foundation's financial architecture appeared erratic and reactive. The impression arose that decisions were driven more by short-term projects and media impact than by sustainable goals. The situation became particularly problematic when deadlines were missed. A failed financial report and an outstanding renewal fee led to the foundation being temporarily classified as non-compliant. Formally, the amount was manageable, but the symbolic impact was significant. In the world of institutional philanthropy, such omissions are considered a warning sign because they raise doubts about internal organization and prioritization. For a foundation that thrived on the prestige of well-known names, this blemish was doubly damaging. Within the royal household, this issue was considered particularly sensitive. A combination of declining donations, rising costs, and regulatory concerns stood in stark contrast to the impression conveyed by international appearances. While the foundation publicly spoke of global engagement and moral leadership, its accounting painted a picture of decline and structural insecurity. This discrepancy fueled suspicions that its public image was no longer supported by a stable financial foundation. Personnel changes also contributed to the unease. Indications of restructuring, a lack of contract renewals, and reduced project activities reinforced the impression that the foundation was in a defensive phase. Internal memos spoke of a transition to a kind of cost control mode. In itself, this would not have been scandalous, but in conjunction with lavishly staged trips and high-profile engagements, it appeared contradictory. It was precisely at this point that criticism from palace circles began. The issue wasn't so much whether a private foundation should be allowed to experience financial difficulties, but rather how this situation was communicated. The public continued to be presented with the image of an active, influential organization, while the internal figures told a different story. This lack of synchronicity was seen as a risk to trust, not only with the foundation itself, but also with the monarchy, whose symbolism was ever present. The media quickly seized upon these contradictions, shifting the focus from personal drama to structural issues. Commentators questioned whether this revealed a fundamental problem with modern celebrity life: high visibility but fragile substance. The Archewell Foundation, for example, became a catalyst for a broader debate about transparency, accountability, and managing public expectations. At the end of this period came a sobering realization: the financial discrepancies were not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that alarmed the palace. When aspiration and reality diverge so drastically, a trust gap inevitably arises. Was this merely a phase that could be rectified, or did the figures point to a deeper problem that would inevitably have further consequences? The trip to Nigeria proved to be the moment when abstract concerns transformed into a concrete crisis. What initially appeared to be a symbolic, charitable visit abroad, upon closer inspection became a diplomatic minefield. Internal assessments revealed that the handling and public perception of this trip bore a striking resemblance to official royal visits. This very fact set off alarm bells behind the scenes. Outwardly, a familiar image prevailed: ceremonial receptions, meetings with high-ranking officials, and security measures usually reserved for active members of the royal family. The staged event inevitably conveyed an impression of institutional backing, but behind the scenes, a different reality unfolded. The Archewell Foundation, formerly the organizer of the visit, was operating under restricted regulatory conditions at the time. This alone should have made such an undertaking impossible. The manner of entry and assistance was particularly sensitive. Nigerian authorities later confirmed that special procedures had been used, procedures normally reserved for diplomats or officially appointed officials. Expedited processes, secure movement zones, and military escorts created an impression hardly compatible with the self-image of a purely private engagement. Within the palace, a central question therefore arose. Who had requested these privileges and on what basis? Princess Anne had this point specifically investigated. She demanded clarity regarding which ministries had been contacted, whether British diplomatic offices were involved, and what wording had been used in official correspondence. At its core, the question was whether royal authority had been used, consciously or unconsciously, to gain advantages. For Anne, this was not a trivial matter, but a potential violation of the constitutional separation between the Crown and private commerce. Prince William supported this investigation with a sober analysis of the impact. Internal assessments emphasized that public perception in a diplomatic context is often more important than formal details. Even without an explicit claim to an official role, the outward form of engagement could be interpreted as an implicit message. This was precisely where the danger lay. The line between personal involvement and state representation became almost completely blurred for outsiders. This ambiguity did not go unnoticed in Nigeria. Local partner organizations later admitted internally that they had assumed a closer connection to the British monarchy than actually existed. Sponsors and supporters reacted with irritation when it became clear that there was no formal royal mandate. This indirectly placed not only the Archewell Foundation but also the royal family in an awkward position. The impression that unclear lines of authority had been tacitly tolerated suddenly arose. For the palace leadership, this was the decisive turning point. Until then, they had opted for restraint to avoid further escalation. But the trip to Nigeria showed that silence itself had become a risk. If international actors assumed royal ties without explicitly denying them, a gradual erosion of authority threatened. This was precisely where Princess Anne saw the line crossed. The visit was increasingly scrutinized by the media. Commentators questioned not only the motivation but also the legitimacy of the trip. Why did a private charity visit require such an official air? Why wasn't the foundation's limited status communicated openly? And how could an organization with financial and regulatory problems simultaneously undertake a trip of such magnitude? These questions coalesced into an unsettling overall picture. The Nigeria trip became a symbol of a strategy that prioritized impact over sufficient structural safeguards. For the palace, it was clear that the matter could no longer be dismissed as a misunderstanding. It demanded a systemic response that went beyond isolated trips. At the end of this phase, a realization emerged that was already considered irreversible internally. The Nigeria visit had demonstrated how quickly private initiatives can be overshadowed by the crown when clear boundaries are lacking. But was the monarchy now prepared to draw binding conclusions from this? Or would it remain merely a matter of cautionary words that went largely unnoticed internationally? The diplomatic embarrassment was followed by an institutional response that made it clear the palace wanted to extricate teachers from the escalating situation. Prince William now moved more prominently into the spotlight, not with personal comments, but with structural measures. While Princess Anne had drawn the moral and procedural line, William took on the task of permanently securing this boundary. Internally, it quickly became clear that criticizing individual incidents would not suffice. The system itself needed to be tightened. The central question was how modern royal work could be clearly defined in an era of global media presence. Prince William was already responsible for several large-scale initiatives that operated under strict governance rules. These programs were characterized by transparent financial structures, clearly defined responsibilities, and verifiable working hours. This very contrast to the Archewell Foundation's methods now came into focus. Internal comparisons revealed the vast gap that had grown between the two models. In response, a new framework was designed, internally dubbed the Transparency Offensive. The aim was to avoid any appearance of ambiguity in the future. Going forward, it should be unequivocally clear who is acting on behalf of the Crown, to what extent, and on what legal basis. These measures were not intended as an attack on individuals, but as a safeguard for the institution. Nevertheless, all involved were aware that the implications would be far-reaching. Prince William placed particular emphasis on the strict separation of public charity and private branding. The new guidelines stipulated that any activity even indirectly related to royal symbolism required explicit authorization. Financial resources raised under the guise of royal proximity should henceforth be fully traceable. These principles aimed to restore trust and prevent misunderstandings before they could arise. Internally, the introduction of these standards was considered a necessary step to ensure the monarchy's future viability. The pressures of modern media logic, in which images and narratives often outweigh formal responsibilities, had highlighted the risks. Prince William recognized that passive demarcation was no longer sufficient. The institution had to actively define what it stood for and what it did not. Publicly, this realignment was presented as a pragmatic reform. Behind the scenes, however, it was clear that it also represented a direct reaction to the developments surrounding the Archewell Foundation. Clear rules eliminated any potential gray areas. The message was unambiguous. Anyone suggesting royal affiliation without official authorization jeopardizes not only their own credibility but also that of the entire monarchy. The media reacted to this move in different ways. Some observers saw it as a long overdue modernization push. Others spoke of a subtle show of force. Undeniably, however, Prince William was setting a new tone. Instead of personal conflicts, a rules-based approach emerged, leaving little room for interpretation. This very pragmatism lent the measures additional force. The palace emphasized that these standards were non-negotiable. They applied regardless of popularity, media reach, or family ties. This sent a signal that extended far beyond the current conflict. The monarchy positioned itself as an institution prepared to accept even uncomfortable consequences to maintain its integrity. By the end of this chapter, a clear shift in direction was evident. A single controversy had given rise to structural reform. However, a crucial question remained. Would these new rules be accepted, or would they provoke a backlash that would truly ignite the conflict? With the institutional realignment of the palace, the conflict increasingly shifted to another level: public perception. While Princess Anne and Prince William emphasized rules, procedures, and distance, a distinctly different dynamic began to emerge on the other side. Observers noted a noticeable change in the communication surrounding Meghan Markle. Instead of addressing specific accusations, an increasingly emotional narrative took center stage, diverting attention from figures, responsibilities, and protocols. Public appearances and media appearances painted a picture shaped less by organizational details than by personal experience. The narrative emphasized resistance, structural injustice, and the claim to fulfill a moral mandate despite external criticism. This strategy was calculated. It shifted the debate from verifiable facts to questions of identity, motivation, and the power to define the narrative. Therein lay its strength, but also its risk. Media analyses quickly revealed that this narrative was received differently internationally. While some members of the public interpreted the message as a confident defense, skepticism grew in Britain. Commentators questioned why key issues remained unanswered. The financial irregularities of the Archewell Foundation, the preferential treatment during the Nigeria trip, and the new palace directives were not directly addressed. Instead, the impression arose that criticism was being reinterpreted as an expression of a larger systemic problem. This shift in perspective had consequences. Within the palace, it was seen as an attempt to personalize the conflict and thus remove it from the institutional sphere. Princess Anne is said to have emphasized internally that emotions are no substitute for accountability. Prince William also maintained the position that transparency was non-negotiable. The gap between the two communication approaches became increasingly apparent. At the same time, the tone of the media intensified. Editorials no longer just questioned responsibility, but credibility. The central criticism was that the public self-presentation did not correspond with documented reality. The accusation of deliberate ambiguity gained traction. The issue was no longer whether the commitment was sincere, but whether it was portrayed accurately. This distinction became the core of the debate. Even former supporters became increasingly reserved in their statements. Commentaries and analyses spoke of weariness. The general consensus was that the public was willing to hear personal stories, but expected clear answers when public funds, titles, and symbolism were involved. The emotional counter-strategy began to lose its effectiveness. What had initially served as a shield became an amplifier of the criticism. In parallel, the palace deliberately adopted a policy of restraint. No direct replies, no public rebuttals, no personalization. Instead, the focus was placed on the ongoing work of active members of the royal family. This quiet strategy of contrast proved effective. The louder the emotional narrative became, the stronger the palace's pragmatic stance seemed to appear. For observers, a picture of a fundamental misunderstanding solidified. On the one hand, there was the claim to act independently as private actors while simultaneously asserting moral authority. On the other hand, the palace insisted on clear roles and verifiable structures. The media's counter-strategy failed to resolve this tension. Instead, it made it more apparent. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the conflict had long since transcended individual accusations. It was no longer just about a foundation or a trip, but about the question of how influence is legitimized. Is emotional conviction sufficient to secure public credibility, or does it necessarily require transparency? The answer seemed inescapably approaching. The turning point came quietly but definitively. After deadlines had passed and the requested clarifications failed to materialize, the royal household did not respond with further explanations, but with a measure whose starkness left little room for interpretation. Official statements regarding public representation stipulated that the Duke and Duchesses of Sussex would no longer be authorized to conduct activities under a royal title or with corresponding symbolism. This ended a years-long period of ambiguity. Within the palace, this step was considered a necessary consequence. The previously established policy now carried institutional weight. Princess Anne saw it as the logical continuation of her early intervention. For her, it was crucial that the signal remained clear and verifiable. No more gray areas, no more tacit acceptance. The Crown, according to the internal interpretation, had to act visibly to protect its integrity. Prince William explicitly supported this course. From his perspective, the measure was less a sanction than a clarification, in which roles were clearly defined, intended to prevent private initiatives from continuing to operate in the shadow of the monarchy. The decision was understood as part of a larger reform aimed at redefining the relationship between public service and private branding. The reactions were correspondingly fierce. In Britain, the debate shifted noticeably. Polls showed growing support for the palace's actions. Many observers considered the move overdue and consistent. At the same time, the impression intensified that the period of tactical silence was finally over. The monarchy had decided to prioritize clarity over harmony. The break was also noticed internationally. Partner organizations that had previously cultivated a close relationship with the Crown were forced to adjust their communications. In several cases, collaborations were reviewed or suspended. This put the Archewell Foundation under further pressure, as the symbolic support it had long relied on was now officially withdrawn. Meghan Markle did not respond to this development with a direct statement on the measures themselves. Instead, the strategy of focusing attention on personal narratives continued. But without the institutional context, this narrative lost its impact. The public discussion had shifted. It now revolved less around motives than around consequences. The withdrawal of royal closeness fundamentally altered the situation. For the royal family, This moment marked a conclusion, not in the sense of a dramatic end, but as a deliberate break. The relationship was redefined, the roles clearly defined. Responsibility for further steps now lay entirely with those involved. The palace had formulated, documented, and implemented its position. In retrospect, it became clear that this outcome was not the result of a single event, but rather a chain of developments. Financial discrepancies, regulatory shortcomings, diplomatic irritations, and counter-strategies in the media had coalesced into a picture that demanded action. The monarchy opted for order over ambiguity. At the end of this final chapter, one key insight remained. The conflict was less personal than public headlines suggested. It was an expression of a fundamental tension between modern self-promotion and institutional responsibility. The palace's decision made it clear on which side this tension would be resolved in the future. But how would this rupture affect public trust and the perception of all involved in the long term? The events surrounding Princess and Prince William Meghan Markle, and the Archewell Foundation mark one of the most significant turning points since the Duke and Duchess of Sussex's retirement from active royal service. What began as a formal review evolved into a comprehensive reassessment of the boundaries between private engagement and royal authority. Financial discrepancies, neglected duties, and a public image that was effective but institutionally unclear led to growing unrest within the palace. The Nigeria trip acted as a catalyst, revealing how quickly private activities can be perceived as official representation when symbols, procedures, and language are not clearly separated. Princess Anne responded with an unequivocal demarcation, and Prince William with structural reform. Together, they sent a signal that extended beyond the specific case. The media's counter-strategy failed to halt this development. Instead, it reinforced the impression that emotional narratives are insufficient to answer institutional questions. The formal withdrawal of royal authority ended years of gray areas. The monarchy opted for transparency, even at the cost of an open break. In the long term, this process raises fundamental questions. How can charitable work be credible when it is spearheaded by prominent figures? Where is the line between personal influence and public responsibility? And what lessons can an institution draw that seeks to exist between tradition and modern media reality? The answers to these questions will not only shape the image of the monarchy but also redefine the understanding of power and responsibility in the public sphere.